book club. We are so excited to report this is our 11th book. And so we are reading Praisesong for the Kitchen Ghost by Crystal Wilkinson. And Crystal is a former Kentucky poet laureate. So that is exciting. I think she's our first Kentucky poet laureate that we've had on the book club. So that's pretty exciting. Um, and I'm not going to go any further into this book because we have our expert with us, who is Chef Tanya Whitehouse, who is our chef in residence. And she is the chef manager of the Food Connection on the University of Kentucky campus. And so, Chef T, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mindy. Well, I'm so excited to be doing my first book club, and I'm certainly excited to be doing it on this book. This is one of my favorite memoirs, food memoirs. Crystal doesn't call it a cookbook, so I guess I'll call it a food memoir with lots of recipes. I have kind of flattened my book out because I have looked at it so much. And so I'm so excited that we're sharing this book and that we're building a community around it and can share these wonderful lyrical stories. So I'm going to bring up some slides, Mindy, and share my screen. There we go. All right. So, as Mindy said, we're going to share Praisesong for the Kitchen Ghost. I hope you have read the initial chapters that we set out for the October 27th book club. And just a few rules about the book club. Please come ready to share, even if you don't get the full reading done. Don't worry about that, but we want your participation. We want for you to, this book is great about talking about our own foodways and telling our own stories because we can relate to it so well. So please come ready to share and listen. And I hope that we will learn from one another. Most importantly, we want to value everyone's opinion and allow space for people to speak, for everyone to speak. But sometimes when we talk about these histories, things can get emotional or difficult. So let's keep everything that's said here confidential. And we don't want to criticize any comments, but we can offer counter opinions because we all come from different experiences. The way you want to couch that is, I see it differently, or I've had a different experience. And you will be able to fill out some questions in a Qualtrics form rather than in the chat like we normally do on the recording. So today we're going to look at the introduction, the chapters titled How I Learned to Cook, The Basket Meeting, Blackberries, Blackberries, and What These Women Know About Bread. Next week, I hope you'll go ahead and read Tasting Indian Creek, Out in the Wild, The King of Sorghum, and Hog Wild About Pork. And then we have two more, and I won't go over those. We'll just stick to the chapters we're coming up on now. If you are new to Big Blue Book Club and have not joined us on Facebook, we have a special group just for BBBC. You can scan this code with a tablet or with your phone. It'll take you to the group and you can join there and join in on the discussion and get updates. So just a little bit of background about Crystal. She lives in Lexington, which is marvelous. I get to see her every once in a while, and I have seen her speak many times, and it's quite emotional. She really pours herself and her food history and her food ways into not only her writing, but when she speaks as well. And she's just as lyrical when she speaks as when she writes. So she is a novelist and a poet. She's written many essays. As Mindy said, she is Kentucky's former poet laureate. She was poet laureate from 2021 to 2023. She has won multiple awards. She just received another one. I can't remember the name of it. Just in the last week, she went down south to receive that. She is a UK professor in English, and she's a member of the Appalachian Writers Group, that was started by another Kentucky writer, Frank X. Walker. She is also a former bookstore owner with her husband Ron, and I've got a picture of them in front of their bookstore. It was Wild Fig Books. If you ever had the pleasure to go there, they had two locations in Lexington at one time. And then this location also had a cafe in it, and that's where some of her more modern recipes come from in the book. But I do like to say that she's partner to her husband Ron. She's a mother and a grandmother. As you'll learn in these narratives, she's a niece, a daughter, a granddaughter, and a great-granddaughter, and so on. She really goes into a lot of her family tree in some of these stories. So I do want to point out some of her other books because they are marvelous as well. Perfect Black is her compilation of poetry. And as you can see, that's got some awards on there as well. Birds of Opulence and Blackberries are collections of short stories. And then Water Street is her novel. So if you enjoyed Praisesong, you might want to check out some of her other writing. It certainly is beautiful and touching and evocative, I think is one of the best ways to talk about it. So let's hop into the introduction. And she talks about this concept. She opens up by explaining this concept of the kitchen ghost on page 2, where she says, "The concept of the kitchen ghosts came to me years ago when I realized that my ancestors are always with me, and that the women most present when I'm chopping or stirring are standing at the stove. The art of cooking and engaging with my kitchen ghosts made me realize that food is never just about the present. Every dish, every slice, every crumb and kernel also tethers us to the past." And I think many of us can feel that way as well. Not all of us, certainly. I know some people don't have the same kind of relationships that a lot of us grew up with around family and food and events centered around food. So we have to acknowledge that and make space for that. But I think a lot of people do have ties to previous generations, or at least beloved people, through food, through the sharing of food, if not from the past, from people that we're sharing food with today, but we bring our past to those tables. Another part that was really interesting, how Crystal literally dug into the archives of her past, going to find records about her family and her ancestors, and found her great grandmother Aggie, and found out about her and her husband Tarleton, and that's what gave her the last name Wilkinson, and how there's this difficult wrestling with a man who married his wife while at the same time owning her. And Crystal talks about if they were husband and wife, even secretly at the time, why did he feel the need to deed her simple household items that she would have used every day? I often imagine her telling him that he owned her and their 10 children, but there was nothing that was hers. Later, he deeded her land, but it's fascinating to me as a cooking woman to think that her first burst of empowerment in 1824 may have come in the form of the accoutrements for her kitchen. So I think this is fascinating that we talk about women's empowerment in the kitchen, because it's not always viewed as that way. But that Aggie could have had something of her own, that she could call her own and own herself, in the deeding of these kitchen instruments. Lastly, in our introduction chapter, this is something I think we all think about. There's someone who we think, oh, they made that perfect and I'll never be able to make it like them. And just as I say, nobody can cook like my grandmother. My grandmother said she regretted that she was never as good a cook as her mother. And I think many of us worry that we can't be the same kind of cooks as our mothers or our grandmothers or aunts, in-laws, and the people who we think are wonderful cooks. And maybe that's a bit of nostalgia, or maybe that's just maybe they held back an ingredient from showing you how to do it or in the recipe. So I think we all have one of those people that we just feel like we can never measure up to the way that they cook. Moving on, we'll go into how I learned to cook, the next chapter we were assigned for this week. And Crystal starts talking about how she grew up on her grandparents' farm on that bit of land that Tarleton and Aggie owned in Indian Creek. On page 27, if you'll turn there, supper in my childhood was on the table by 6 in the evening. Lamb fries, frog legs, fried whiting or catfish, neck bones, fried chicken and gizzards, corn pudding, tall glasses of water pulled from the well or sweet tea, biscuits topped with rhubarb, butter, and sugar. If you didn't get hungry after that, you must have just had a meal. So, this litany of food that was available while she grew up on her grandparents' farm is something that Crystal turns to often. She makes these mantras of all of the abundance that they had and gratitude for that kind of abundance, even as they might have grown up in poverty, but they were self-sufficient and they grew and raised a lot of their own food. She talks about that many times. But along with the litany of food, she talks about how in order to have that food, the work is just never finished. So after this dinner, and maybe she would go play, they would come back into the house. And she says her grandfather nodded in the reclining chair. My grandmother quilted, sewed clothes for herself and me, but always had her eye on something in the oven. Bread, a pie for our preacher or someone whose loved one had done crossover. I read books, learned, waited. So you see that even after doing all of the labor of putting these 3 meals a day on the table, her grandmother is still doing labor, even while sitting down, and still cooking and trying to cook for other people once they had sustained themselves. And then you see the early origins of Crystal's love for reading and for writing. And for learning. So it started very early on. And then Crystal talks quite a bit about how she stood at her grandmother's side, learning how to do all of these different types of recipes. And as an adult, we'll move on over to page 30. We see that it has stayed with her into adulthood. I cooked everything from scratch in order to heal my family, in order to heal myself. My children were grown before I stopped cooking like that. I've spent my entire life striving to be a competent cook, to show my love and care through food. And in the same way, she talks about her grandmother and all of the work that she did and how she did it out of love. On page 33, she says, my grandmother nursed my fevers, kissed my bruises, encouraged my dreams. She filled first her pots and then our bellies in the same way that her mother and grandmothers had for generations. Through slavery, through manumission, through the Great Depression, through poverty, through the civil rights movement, through racism. Women of this ilk always find a way. So Crystal is showing that even when you go through hard times, and I think a lot of us, our families went through something similar. I know that my grandparents went through the Great Depression also, through poverty, but I think my grandmother took pride in being able to keep her children clean and keep them fed. And so as long as their bellies were full, my grandmother's philosophy was that they could get through anything. And I think Crystal's showing that too, and that how that's a generational skill. Just pushing forward, keeping your family moving, keeping your family together, no matter what is going on in the rest of the world. And then we get to the basket meeting. I love the section on page 69 where Crystal says that when she's preparing meals, she kind of uses the same Sunday ritual as a basket meeting almost. That each Saturday I carefully chose my vegetables, gathered my ingredients, imagined me going through Granny's garden or through her pantry to carefully select everything I needed. And I think many of us can relate to that of going to our grandparents' cellar or going to get potatoes out of the cellar or putting them up in the attic or the top of a building to cure. Going to some kind of pantry and picking out your tomatoes or your green beans instead of getting them from the store. And when you don't have that option anymore, it can feel like a bit of a loss. You can feel a bit of grief for not having the stores, yes, but also the love that was put into those jars along with those vegetables. And then she talks about the origin of the Sunday basket meal. On page 70, she says that this Sunday ritual probably came from when people were enslaved, because our enslaved ancestors usually received food rations on Saturday night, which opened the door for a large meal to be prepared on Sunday, which is also typically the only day that they had off from work. This is also the origin of traditional Sunday suppers. So sometimes something that is a ritual and a comforting ritual to us can have origins that are rooted in pain, rooted in suffering, but we turn them around in order to make them a celebration of the liberation that can be found in community. While that might be a little bit of a difficult topic to think about, it is rooted in foodways in a lot of ways. If you start to look into food systems very deeply, you're going to find some difficult topics. On page 73, she talks about the larder that her mother takes with her grandmother takes with her to the basket meeting that takes 2 trips to the church. So her grandfather is loading up the car with whole pressure cooker pots of green beans and new potatoes. Were lidded and carefully lowered into cardboard boxes. I can hear that sound. I can hear the big pots being lowered in the cardboard boxes. Fried corn simmered in a cast iron skillet. Sweet potatoes with marshmallows rested in a white Corningware dish with a blue cornflower insignia. And I know I've got a couple of those Corningware dishes floating around still in the back of my cabinets. We have lots of convenient ways to take food now that are a little easier than putting rubber bands on a Corningware dish and wrapping it up in a tea towel. But I can still see everything that she's talking about. And I love how she brings this imagery forward of this packaging of all of this food in order to care for it while they take it to the church. And then toward the end of the chapter on page 74, she talks about her grandmother's caramel cake and trying to make the boiled icing on it, which intimidates me too, even as a chef. Baking a cake from scratch is easy. You can't really mess it up, but trying to replicate Granny's caramel icing still gives me fits. I remember as a younger woman mixing that caramel and cooking it until you got a soft ball in cold water. I remember calling Granny many times as I stood in my kitchen in tears, surrounded by bowls and cups of cloudy cold sugar water, but no softballs. And I have been in that frustrating state myself, or trying to make a jam or a syrup come out the right consistency and having like 4 condensation covered plates where I was trying to check the consistency of it. So while we can pass on a lot of these recipes, some of them are not going to be as easy as others, and sometimes it's going to take a little practice with those. The next chapter is Blackberries, Blackberries. And Crystal has used this imagery quite a bit. As we saw earlier, her collection of short stories. It's called Blackberries, Blackberries. And she talks a lot in the beginning of this chapter of her love for blackberries, especially on page 119. For the longest time, I thought this longing was somehow in our blood. But now I realize that the reason we craved blackberries had more to do with homesickness than it did for our love of fruit. So Crystal harkens back to that time when she was a child and would go with her grandmother to the cemetery and pick blackberries. And if you've picked blackberries, you know the struggle of dealing with the chiggers and watching out for the snakes, like she talks about. But the contemplation of picking those blackberries in the cemetery and who was laid there really has informed this ghost story that she includes in this chapter as well. And it's a really difficult one when she talks about Aggie as a young girl with her cousin Hannah. The sun was filtering through the trees up the hill, and the grass across the field we just walked through bent a little in the wind. We come to the berries, and I was showing Hannah how to stick her hands into the briars as quickly as she could when she walked over to Big Sarah's baby's grave and laid down. So even as children, we see that the tension and pressure of the lives that they're leading, even as young girls, is starting to weigh them down. And you see Aggie trying to lift Hannah up and Hannah just kind of giving in to the weight of it all. And that's a very difficult passage to read. So one, I thank you for joining me in reading such a difficult passage, and it might bring us a lot of discomfort. But again, this is part of some people's history and part of their culture, and it is still linked to their foodways. And we would be missing part of Crystal's story if we weren't reading it. Next, we'll move on to what these women know about bread. And I know that a lot of us here in Kentucky, this we could relate to, about having some kind of quick bread or white bread with every meal, no matter how many carbs you might have in that feast, you still have to have some bread on the side. And Crystal's family is no different. But I love how we just had cornbread and biscuits. So I love how she described how she would alter the type of bread depending on what she was going to serve it with. So cornbread with a tablespoon of sugar added goes better with soup beans. You need a more dense cornbread for dressing. Hot water cornbread is the better companion for cabbage. Which is interesting because some people grow up with one kind of cornbread and they kind of stick to that kind. And we have these sort of arguments back and forth about whether it should be sweet or white or yellow or savory. Should it be an iron skillet? Should it be a hoe cake or a corn stick? So I think those conversations are revealing about our foodways and our food identity in a way. And I think it's interesting how we kind of cling to them a bit. But then some people love to try new things and love to try others' ways of preparing things. And then we see this passage that comes out of this consideration of all of the different breads that were provided. In Patsy Riffey and her husband, William. And William comes running in while Patsy is trying to fix hoe cakes for her boarders. Excited, saying, "Word came that Lincoln freed us," William said. And Patsy asked, "What kind of more free you think you're getting, William?" So I think this is, again, another difficult passage about liberation and being free and the concept of ownership and how you find freedom, whether that's a federal emancipation or even within the system of slavery, how you find your own freedom. And I think it's interesting that she ties this history of all of these breads her family had to Patsy cooking this one particular kind of bread for other people. and talking about her and her husband's own freedom and even suppressing some of that talk in front of the boarders. So she always finds a way to manage to have multiple layers in everything that she's writing. So that's a quick overview. Mindy, we're going to put this up on the Facebook page, and then there'll be a Qualtrics form for people if they want to engage with the questions surrounding the reading.
Is exactly right. So the link, you'll see the link at the bottom of the screen where you can answer the questions that are addressed, that we've addressed throughout this session of book club. And you can join us live next week, which is November the 3rd at 12:30 Central Time, 1:30 Eastern. Um, and if you have not registered, I will also pop that link on the bottom of the screen so you can see that, and you can register so that you can join us live and get the link, the Zoom link. Otherwise, we'll see you next week. And Chef T, I appreciate you taking the time to share with us today.
It's my pleasure.